The Memphis Grizzlies picked up a big win over the Dallas Mavericks. They had a big win off the court as well as their superstar Ja Morant came back into the fold. To discuss Ja Morant and more with me, starting off this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, the great Bomani Jones. We'll be talking about it next. Stick with us. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a special edition of Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, flying solo on this episode. Of course, to Michael Cole, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal covering the Memphis Grizzlies, my co-host, not able to join us here today, but that is quite all right. I have a more than capable, at least for the first segment, co-host to join me as a guest here on Locked On Grizzlies. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. You can also check us out over on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, all those fun things continue to make to Michael and I and Bomani today part of your Locked On Grizzlies experience. My guest for this first part of today's special show is the host of Game Theory with Bomani Jones on HBO and HBO Max. You can also catch him with the Right Time podcast over as part of ESPN Podcasts. He is Bomani Jones. Bomani, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. It is appreciated.
No problem, man. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So we'll jump right in. And I the reason I wanted to seek you out, I've followed your work for a while, and I think you do tremendous work. But I really thought that you spoke well, and you know, so much of the national media, and we don't have to go too far down that rabbit hole. The attention is very sensationalized when it comes to Morant. I thought you covered it pretty rationally on your program and other guest spots you've done. So as far as Ja's return, now, right? We don't have to rehash the stuff of the last couple of weeks. And like I said, you've covered it pretty well. He was back on the court on Monday against the Dallas Mavericks, not in terms of uniform, but in terms of physically being out there. You see him interacting with the teammates. They asked him and others, or not him. One of the reasons my co-host is not with us is he is currently at shoot around and practice, trying to get a feel for Ja, you know, being back with the team. But he was there in street clothes. He was there watching the game, celebrating the win, the come-from-behind win over Dallas. What is your overall perception moving forward of Morant now that he has completed this counseling? Obviously, that process is ongoing. When you look at Ja starting now, kind of like the second act of his NBA career, what are things that you're looking for short-term, long-term in terms of his continued rehabilitation of not just his image, but obviously, you know, taking him at his word, his health?
Yeah, so the thing is, I don't know how much we're going to be able to find out from here because we only found out this stuff once it reached a crisis point, right?
That's true.
Like the only things that we found out about were so over the top, allegedly, that we have no idea what things might have been of lower level than that get all the way up. Like I always said, the thing that was tricky for me is I felt like even if they didn't say so explicitly, they used some pretty big terms to explain why it was that he was gone. And that don't seem like something that you fix in just a couple of weeks. And I looked at the organization funny when they said, well, now we're just going to start leaving cities immediately after games. Ha, ha, ha. How about that? You shouldn't have to do that. These are grown-ups. These are professionals. And if you don't think that Morant can handle such a thing, then Morant probably shouldn't be coming back, right? I hope for his own sake, and I think this is the biggest thing to monitor, is how well are you handling pressure? Because if the pressure that was put upon you prior to now was too much, it's about to be the NBA playoffs. And for what it's worth, the NBA playoffs, and he is the leader of a team that isn't really that good at scoring, and he's probably the only guy on the team that can be trusted to get his own shot. That's a lot more pressure. You know, so for his own sake, I hope he handles all those things, you know, as well as he possibly can. But I don't know how much we're going to be able to outwardly observe. And this isn't a knock to him, but I don't know how much sincerity we're going to get from him when he talks about these things in front of us, because there's so much money on the line. There's so much behind him that what you're going to get is probably more likely to be kind of program responses.
You're exactly right about the follow-through mattering a good bit here. And I personally will be monitoring that as well, starting with his anticipated return to the floor against the Houston Rockets on Wednesday. That's the time that we're expecting him to actually be playing again. But you bring up an interesting point on your show, or you brought up an interesting point about him being the next great American basketball star, and how even beyond just Memphis, right? Because you're pretty familiar with Memphis, and I thought you articulated that connection to the city well on the show as well. But in terms of him nationally, it's fair to say that, and you talk about this, the Grizzlies were the fun team. They were the Sacramento Kings last year, right? They were the Immaculate Vibes, and they were the team that everybody was super excited to watch and see. ESPN made a big deal, had an entire day about the Memphis Grizzlies. Fast forward 365 days, and between that, Dillon Brooks being Dillon Brooks, all sorts of other things going on with the team, there has been kind of it's permeated throughout the entire roster, almost like the Grizzlies are the villains of the NBA now. I find that interesting because, you have guys like Desmond Bane who, are posting pictures from baptisms, right? And things like that, very forward and open about who he is as a person. And there's obviously levels to that. Jaren Jackson Jr. seems interested in music and fashion, up and down the Grizzlies roster. You've got Steven Adams doing commercials for March Madness. How much on the national scale does Ja Morant's actions impact the perception of the Grizzlies as a whole? Because you've said it yourself, if Memphis is viewed this way now because of Ja, how will that impact a Desmond Bane type who, when he's playing his best, is an all-star caliber guard in his own right? How will that impact the perception of not just Bane, but others that wear Grizzlies uniforms moving forward?
Honestly, the thing I think that Morant did that probably affects the perception more than anything else is we good in the West. Like, we good in the West made everybody look up and be like, why? you guys haven't won anything at this point. And I think especially when you start talking about older people, when they hear stuff like that, that's when people start getting sour, right? Where they feel like there's a level of entitlement that seems to exist here that isn't founded. Like that, if you really look at the ways that people looked at the Grizzlies, that's when it started going downhill and kind of the chirping and going back and forth and all things Dillon Brooks. Like, I think Dillon Brooks is necessary in the ecosystem. That's somebody that people dislike entirely, not on his side. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how many Grizzlies fans look at him and he's like, yeah, man, heart and soul, right? Like, that's the kind of thing you get off him. The league needs dudes like that. Like, I think it makes things better, where it can be very frustrating that this dude who shoots like 39% can still be effective at points and get under everybody's skin. Like, I think all of that is good and necessary to kind of get on people's nerves. I think we good in the West honestly offended a lot of people's sensibilities. And then you add to that the thing that happened with Shannon Sharp at that game, right? It just became a lot of little things, I think, that stacked up with people. Whereas now, I don't think the thing that happened with Morant really extends to the way that people view that team because it's so localized to one person. Like, if the whole team was out there when he was doing that, then I think that people would look at it a little bit differently. But I think in terms of like the malfeasance of it all, that's been pretty localized to him.
Writing checks that you can't cash necessarily on the court. And obviously, one of the prevailing themes with all of this happening with Ja signing the max contract, he's won, right? The battle is over off the floor. And whether it's for perception or whatever the reason, he's chosen to continue a lot of those, attempts to give off some sort of image. And it seems to distract from that reality that you just talked about. Now the Grizzlies, as the number 2 seed in the Western Conference, Sacramento right on their heels, they're going to have a series against the Dallas Mavericks, the Golden State Warriors again. They have to kind of turn their attention to that. We'll get you out of here on this, Bomani. I really appreciate your time. The idea of the Grizzlies being fine in the West, right? Turning to basketball. Steven Adams hopefully coming back in the next few weeks, but he's been out for a very long time. Brandon Clark suffering the torn Achilles that he suffered. This team is wounded, but they are returning Ja Morant. In the absence of Ja Morant, you've seen an expansion of Jaren Jackson Jr.'s game. He kind of looks like Giannis light at this stage in terms of how he's been scoring in recent games, last 3 or 4 times, especially against Dallas. How do you perceive the Grizzlies going into this playoff stretch? The MVP debate with Jokic having the amazing season that he's having offensively, the feel-good story of the Kings, the Warriors lurk. Oh, by the way, the Phoenix Suns have Kevin Durant now. Like, how do you see the Grizzlies kind of fitting into, I'll use your term from a moment ago, the ecosystem that is the Western Conference going into the playoffs? Does any of this impact what they were going to be? Or do the issues with Adams and Clark maybe spell a different outcome more than the off the court issues with Ja.
Well, historically, a team that's got this much off the court stuff going on, even if it is just about one person, but that one person really matters, they typically are hard for you to put your money on, right? To be like, oh, this is the team that's going to do it, especially for a team as young as this one. So it's not like he's got a bunch of guys with that steely resolve that comes from doing this over and over again, right? Like, it makes me apprehensive just on that level. But if we were just talking about basketball, I can't bet against anybody in the West because I can't bet on anybody in the West. Like, I don't blame any team in the West for believing that they can get in and they can win it all, right? If you think that Sacramento has no chance because they play such poor defense in spite of how good their offense is, the Grizzlies, where I wouldn't go as far as to say like poor offense, but they're in the bottom third of the league in points per possession, right? Like, they don't do especially well there. They play really good defense, right? They're in top 5 over there. But on the other side, they don't really bring that to you. So why necessarily would Memphis be more attractive than Sacramento? And by the same token, why would Sacramento be more attractive to Memphis? We could talk about Phoenix. They have Kevin Durant. We'll see how many games Kevin Durant is able to play. There's the weird old Lakers situation where if somehow they got in here and you had a healthy LeBron James, though betting on LeBron and Anthony Davis staying healthy, both of them for 2 months is kind of preposterous. Now, I mean, like, I don't know the last time they were both healthy for a strong run for that long. It may have been 2020. But with that in mind, I mean, I don't have a compelling reason why the Grizzlies can't win the West, because anybody can win the West at this point. And that's why you hope, if you're Memphis, if you guys can just hold this together and everybody get locked in and get focused. And maybe these breathing exercises that Giants worked are as magical as he made them sound like, right? Maybe that'll be enough and they can get it done. We shall see. But no, I think they still have a chance because everybody's got a chance.
I'll get you out of here on this. Ja Morant, again, the thing that stuck with me most was you saying he's the next great American basketball star. He could be. Do you think that's still going to happen for him? We're prognosticating. Do you think that this is who he is, or do you think this is a teachable lesson that he'll take advantage of as best as you can with the information provided to you?
Yeah, I think that he has obviously made a series of bad decisions, and I'm reluctant to go to the this is who he is part, because honestly, if that was the case, we'd have heard about these things happening well before he got to the NBA,
right?
Quote unquote, who he is. I am inclined to believe that some things have happened and he hasn't responded to them well. Does he have the infrastructure around him to improve in those ways? I don't know his squad well enough to answer that question, but it's entirely possible he can get beyond what all of this is. And hopefully for his sake, they nip this in the bud quick, because that boy's cruising for a bruising. Like for me, the way that he was behaving and the things that he was accused of, the least of my concerns is basketball. Like, you got to live behaving like this, and you just don't get to like brandish firearms around people. They don't forget that. Right? They don't look at that and just be like, oh, well, I guess it just happened. They tell people about that. And there's no telling who the person is that they tell or what anything is. And that's where I had to worry for him. But maybe somebody's gotten through to him. I'll be honest. From the interview with Jalen Rose, I did not come away from that feeling like somebody got through to him. I came away from that feeling like somebody gave him the things he needed to say to hurry up and get back to play basketball. But if somebody has gotten through to him, then there's a good chance that we move past this, honestly, like it never happened.
Hopefully that's the way that it works. But I do think that your apprehension is shared by everybody. And even the biased folks in Memphis say that, talk is one thing, action is another. And that is what we'll keep an eye on moving forward. Bomani Jones of Game Theory on HBO, of The Right Time on ESPN Podcasts. Thank you so much for your time here on Locked On Grizzlies. It's appreciated. Thank you.
All right. No problem, man. You have a good one.
All right. You too. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we will be talking Grizzlies Mavericks. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, flying solo once again on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Bomani is gone. Thank goodness for Bomani. What a wonderful segment with him. It was tremendous. Really, really thoroughly enjoyed it. Great topics conversation. And I was impressed with how he handled himself in terms of the questions that were asked, right? I really was really taken back by what he did as a thinker on the Morant saga, because so much bad information and bad takes kind of come from this, right? They put themselves in a position where they want to be sensationalized. That wasn't Bomani Jones. I think he speaks from a place of being concerned about Ja's health, first and foremost, his safety. And that is what all of us are concerned about moving forward. We'll talk more about Ja towards the end of the show. But I do want to talk about the Grizzlies that played on the floor against the Dallas Mavericks on Monday night. It was a really impressive showing from the likes of Jaren Jackson Jr., guys like Desmond Bane. Luke Kennard had another strong showing. It was a good night for the other guys, right? Jaren, obviously, 28 points on 16 shots. That was really strong. Only 2 threes attempted by Jaren in the game. So he got to the basket, took advantage of mismatches off the dribble, those sorts of things that we've talked about before. Tyus Jones, another really strong performance, 6 assists, only 1 turnover, 16 points on a 10-shot efficient night. Bane scored well. But Santi Aldama, right? We talk about the other guys, the guys that don't get the credit that perhaps they deserve. 22 points, 14 rebounds, one of the best games of his career. Again, he only made 2 threes. So he was aggressive getting to the basket. He found ways to clean the glass and, ways that he hasn't consistently done it at any point in his NBA career to this stage. So it was really cool to see Santi Aldama play as well as he did. Luke Kennard hitting 2 threes, getting some strong rebounds, finding a way to be plus 18. Luke Kennard really found himself in a spot to cultivate that comeback that Memphis had to stage, because the Grizzlies were down double digits entering the fourth quarter. And then once that fourth quarter started, Memphis turned it on, a 29-12 final frame. The Dallas Mavericks only scored 12 points. Kyrie Irving, who had a good game overall for the Mavericks, 28 points, scoring, 4 rebounds, no assists for Kyrie, which is low for him, not the best. But he was 0 for 8 in the fourth quarter, and whether he was injured, banged up, whatever the case might be, Dillon Brooks and whoever was assigned to Kyrie there in the fourth, mostly Dillon Brooks, had strong showings. And that really matters a lot for this team going into a potential playoff series with the Dallas Mavericks. This was a good confidence boost for the Memphis Grizzlies because they found themselves in a position where they had to get a win at home against a healthy Dallas Mavericks team, and they really were in position to have to cultivate rhythm in ways that they hadn't been able to do it before. The rhythm of losing the third quarter and getting back at it in the fourth quarter, where they have had struggles this season. They had to win in a different way. Desmond Bane was not the best player on the floor in this game. Jaren Jackson Jr. was. Santi Aldama played better than Xavier Tillman. Luke Kennard had a better showing at times than Dillon Brooks, especially offensively. Dillon was strong defensively, per usual. But the fact remains that this was a team effort, and it was an effort led by those other guys beyond Bane, beyond Tyus. Santi stepped up. Luke Kennard stepped up. David Roddy had another strong showing. Roddy is not, going to always be the most efficient scorer in the league. But what Roddy was capable of doing was filling the void left behind by Dillon when he's on the bench. David Roddy is now the Dillon replacement in terms of defense. It's Roddy drawing that really difficult assignment. And it's impressive to watch him use that frame. It makes a lot of sense if you look at it from Taylor Jenkins' perspective. The reality of this guy is similar in build, similar in frame, similar in physicality to Dillon Brooks. Maybe he doesn't have the same level of mentality that Dillon does, that obviously makes those connections a little bit more aggressively in his brain, however it works for Dillon, perhaps too aggressively, right? Picking up his 18th technical foul. Dillon will miss Wednesday's game against the Houston Rockets, potentially Ja Morant's return, which we'll talk more about here momentarily. But Roddy fills that void in terms of being the physical body to try to implement some of the schemes, almost like Xavier Tillman with Steven Adams, right? X is not Steven Adams as a screener, as a rebounder. Adams is better at those things, but at least X has an adjacent game. He is Adams adjacent. He is comparable in terms of his ability to screen as a rebounder. Same kind of concept with Roddy as a perimeter defender at this stage. At least he has the same physical makeup and build to try to be in a position to better attack an opposing team's best perimeter threat. And that's exactly what happened against the Dallas Mavericks. So it was good to have that energy in FedEx Forum. It was good to see them win in a different way. It was good to see Santi Aldama, who had been struggling in recent games, have a good performance, because they're going to need Santi Aldama in the playoffs. You hope Steven Adams will be back, but Brandon Clark isn't coming back. So Santi, Roddy, those guys are going to have moments of opportunity, and they're going to be asked to be something more than perhaps they've ever been asked to be, especially in those high stakes spots like Bomani Jones talked about earlier in the show. Worried about Ja Morant in those positions. At least we've seen Ja make big buckets, right? Ja has some postseason success in that way. Obviously, Santi and Roddy won't be asked to hit game-winning shots consistently like Ja is. But the fact remains they're going to be put in positions that they're not used to. It's good to see them have some success in the regular season leading up to the postseason in that way. And it got the Grizzlies back into the number 2 seed in the Western Conference, at least for now. When we come back on Locked On Grizzlies, we're going to talk about Ja Morant's return, reintegrating Ja to the team next. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. Big fan of FanDuel, official sports betting partners of the NBA. Obviously, as the season grinds down, as we enter the final stretch here of the NBA, we have the Sweet 16 coming up for the NCAA. Your first bet up to $1,000 with using FanDuel. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. Safe, secure, super easy to use. You can bet on everything from the money line, point scorers, three-pointers drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Getting Ja Morant back into the saddle with the Memphis Grizzlies. We're talking that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, flying solo on this episode. So thankful to DeMichael Cole, my partner, for doing the work that he does. He'll be back with me for Wednesday's show, talking about what Ja Morant said at practice, talking about the plan for Ja going into the Houston game on Wednesday. If you had to coming back against arguably the worst team in the NBA, who has been playing better, but still pretty bad, that's a good game to come back into. So I'm excited to talk to DeMichael about that for Wednesday's show. And thank you again to Bomani Jones, a great guest in the first part of the program, a little different structure to today's show, but I thought it was well worth it to have a guest the caliber of Bomani with us talking about Ja. And Ja is going to continue to be a major topic of conversation, not just here, but everywhere. Because as Bomani Jones has put it, Ja is best in position to be the next great American basketball star. And the redemption arc starts now. Bomani is a little bit more hesitant, a little bit more guarded about what to expect from Ja Morant moving forward. And I think that is fair. In Memphis, we put our arms around, right? We love up on the players. We love up on those that are flawed and that have made mistakes. And we can be biased at times. And that's understandable. And I do think that the response, whether it's applause for Morant when he came back, the cheers, trying to be optimistic, those are all important pieces, not just of fandom, but of the human experience. You want to wish best for Ja, or what is best for Ja. And I wrote about that over at Bluff City Media, talking about Ja being home and realizing the family connections, being a father. All of those sorts of things can help him get through this tough stage and get him where he wants to be as a basketball player. But he has to mean what he says. If you interpreted the Jalen Rose interview as a PR stunt, which I don't want to put words in Bomani's mouth, but he wished he had seen more, right? He thought it was more about, I'm using what Bomani said. Ja was saying what he was told to say. Whether or not he actually believes it, we have to see through action, right? And I don't think quoting NBA YoungBoy lyrics is a reason for concern. But if he were to go back to using social media the same way, if you get word of him going out and, not even necessarily going out just to have fun, but being out at 3 a.m. at places that maybe he shouldn't be doing, things he shouldn't be doing, how much did he learn? I think that's a fair concern, but we got to give him the chance, right? 23-year-old young man made a mistake. He should be given the opportunity to learn from those mistakes that he made, as opposed to being defined by them. I do think Bomani agrees with that sentiment, and I appreciate him giving that insight. On the floor, as a basketball player, aside from jokingly, like Morant saying he was willing to come back as a reserve, and Dylan Brooks saying, to quote Dylan Brooks, hell no. Aside from jokes, how Ja Morant comes back into the fold after missing 9 games, that is going to be worth watching, because Tyus Jones has been really good, right? Tyus Jones has been successful, and in no way, shape, or form am I saying that he should start in front of Ja Morant, because he shouldn't. But as I've talked about here with DeMichael, and I've talked about over at Bluff City Media and other places, Tyus Jones has not been a good true reserve point guard. He's a great insurance policy. When he has to start for Ja Morant, he plays at an extremely high level as a starting point guard in the NBA. He is a starting point guard in the NBA. But the only problem for Tyus is he is not going to be a starter in the NBA for the Memphis Grizzlies when Ja Morant is on the floor, and Ja Morant just signed a 5-year max contract extension. So Tyus has to be able to be in a better position to contribute. I was on GBB Live recently, my old podcast over as part of Grizzly Bear Blues with my good friend Parker Fleming, Grizzlies editor now over at Bluff City Media, my boss. And he talked about playing Tyus more with starters, right? Make sure you're looking for GBB Live and you can hear the full conversation. Making Ja be one of the first guys come off the floor, let Tyus be one of the first guys into the game, put him with Bane, put him with Jaren, give him the best chance to succeed and at least start the game that way so that when he is in a more reserve-heavy lineup, he is in more of a rhythm. I think that makes a ton of sense. That would get my full vote of confidence and support if they were willing to do that. But I also think that you can look at this as an opportunity to tinker with the rotation, maybe start Santi Aldama instead of Xavier Tillman. If you still want to start Tillman, which X has done a good job, that makes total sense. I think that there's windows here. There are windows within who plays well with who. How Luke Kennard plays with Ja Morant, because we haven't seen that a ton. That matters a lot. Offensively, the possibilities are endless. If Bane is great next to Ja, because Bane is a great three-point shooter, the same concept can be applied with Luke Kennard, who you can argue is a better three-point shooter than Desmond Bane. I don't know that I would go that far, but the numbers are comparable in that conversation. Defensively, however, while I am a pretty large Luke Kennard stan, he has his flaws. And to put a below-average defender in Ja next to a lower average defender or maybe even bad defender and Luke Kennard, you almost have to play Dylan Brooks next to them. Or if you believe in David Roddy, you can have Roddy be in that mix. But again, we're talking about reintegration here. Now you are asking Roddy to be that lead defender and take some of the pressure off of Morant and Kennard. Can Roddy do that? Is he ready at this stage to do that? And if he's not ready, it may not matter because the Grizzlies are going to have to try it because of where they're at in terms of their depth and their rotations. How do you get Jaren Jackson Jr., who has looked like Giannis Antetokounmpo at times during this run without Ja Morant? How do you get that offensive aggression to continue with Morant on the floor? Because so often, especially in crunch time, it was call 12, right? Call 12, isolate Ja Morant to the basket, let him cook. Jaren Jackson Jr. has been cooking of late. And if Jaren is able to do what he did against the Dallas Mavericks, helping lead that run and finish that game, you have to have that as an option. So therein lies the rub. And it brings us back to one of the fundamental questions of this Grizzlies franchise for the next several years. How do you better put Ja and Jaren together as offensive weapons? They have struggled in terms of developing that chemistry. It has not come as easily as perhaps it should have. There are reasons to be optimistic moving forward about what this team can be because they're so young. They have time. But at the same time, the clock is ticking in terms of title contention. You have to put yourself in a position now to try to maximize that value. And Jaren and Ja have not clicked in pick and roll, which is what the Grizzlies and Taylor Jenkins love to run so much. Pick and pop, it's sporadic. It's flashes. There's not consistency there. At least there hasn't been. So enabling Jaren to be close to what he currently is while having Ja Morant continue to be the superstar that he is. To me, in the immediate future, that is what matters most in terms of developing this team as a championship contender this season. Without Steven Adams, that wouldn't have been possible, but Adams, in theory, should be back soon, by the playoffs at least. You won't have Brandon Clark, but I think David Roddy and Santi Aldama can replicate a lot of what Clark did, or, again, just in a different way, provide similar impacts. They can't replace Clark alone, but I think the two of them together can provide some of that switchability defensively in the case of Roddy, some of that offensive efficiency in the case of Aldama. There's a window there. It's opening slowly but surely. I talked about last night in the Locked On Now for Locked On Grizzlies. The vibes are returning. You see the window opening. The lighter schedule is helping. However, Ja Morant is about to be back. And that dynamic, both on and off the floor, has the potential to disrupt some of the energy. How they attack the next couple of games against the Houston Rockets matters a heck of a lot. Because if you had to pick a team to try to figure these things out against, the Rockets is a great example. You've got essentially 2 games that have the potential to be, if you handle them correctly, glorified scrimmages. The Rockets don't want to win, right? They're not playing to that level. Their organization is looking to Wemby in the NBA draft lottery. You have a chance here to figure it out over the next few days. They have to maximize those opportunities. I'm optimistic, and we'll talk more about how they can maximize those opportunities on tomorrow's show. So I'm optimistic again. I think that they have a lot of potential there. It's not going to be easy, but they can get the job done. Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. Now make your second listen Game to Game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. Again, on Wednesday's show, DeMichael and I will be back together previewing Grizzlies Rockets. We'll get an update from practice, what the expectations are for Ja in this coming week and beyond. Lots of exciting things to discuss on Wednesday's episode. I hope you'll join us. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Until next time, make sure you're rating, reviewing, subscribing, liking, commenting, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. I am Joe Mullinax. I will see you soon. Stay locked in. This is Locked On Grizzlies.